In journalism, there is a commonly held belief that any headline which contains a question can be answered no. Simple as that. So do you need a 3D printer? Well, no, you don't, to be quite honest. But do you want one? Now that's a question which deserves a little bit more examination, because you might do. You might also not. The trouble is with 3D printing and a lot of emergent technologies is that there's a lot of accepted wisdom that has a lot of inertia. What was true 5 years ago isn't necessarily true now. And you'll still see some of that repeated on message boards and Reddit threads and stuff like that. So if you're looking for a straight answer, sometimes you're going to be dealing with a lot of old knowledge. But take that with a grain of salt as well, because anything I tell you here today in a month's time might also be out of date. To my mind, there are quite a few good reasons why, as a wargamer, you would want a 3D printer. Now, I'm going to talk specifically about resin printers rather than FDM or plastic printers. The latter are quite simple, they're relatively safe, they're an easy investment if you want to churn out a lot of terrain or gaming aids and such like that. But for good miniatures, you really want to look at resin printing, so that's what I'm going to concentrate on. And of course, as well as the upshots, there are a handful of downsides. And being totally transparent, some of them are quite significant, so they are worth knowing about before you make a decision. Do you want to get involved with that? So from the perspective of somebody who's been doing this for a while and is a wargamer, do you want a 3D printer? And we'll start with the downsides, because they are worth examining in detail. The first of those is that resin is a toxic material, and that's quite significant. If you are a parent or somebody who's got littlies running around the house, animals or such like that who like to go exploring, then being able to have somewhere where you can either keep a machine completely secure, lock away resins and such like that, that's quite an investment of space and maybe preparation, money and what have you, because you cannot get it on your skin, you don't want to be breathing it, it's a hazardous material and it needs to be treated as such. Once a resin miniature is cured, you can play with it and paint it and touch it the same as you would any other resin, whether it be poured from Forge World or anywhere else. But that in-between stage requires a little bit of careful handling. Now, it's said sometimes that resin printing is messy. That's not entirely true. I've been printing for a while, and I have in that entire time had one spill, which was more than a couple of spots flicked away from what I was doing. And even then, I don't make a lot of mess very often. The important thing is having a little workspace where you can lay down either a tray or some kitchen towel, and I do the latter. I have kitchen towel laid out under my printers, and I just change it whenever they get a bit of gumph on them. It's easy. This idea that when you take a resin build plate off of the machine and it's dripping everywhere and it's making mess, no. Unless you take that straight out of the machine, the moment it's finished printing, most of the resin is going to drip back into the vat during the printing process. If you're worried about making a mess everywhere, just leave it for half an hour to finish the dripping and then take it out, prep it off as you normally would. Now, speaking of post-print cleanup, that does bring me to a second point, which isn't a strong negative, but it is worth pointing out. Resin, some of them, can require a little bit of, not complex, but fiddly post-processing. So some resins, for example, need to be cleaned in isopropyl alcohol or equivalent, and at the moment that can be pretty pricey to get your hands on, and just like the resin, needs to be kept somewhere safe. Now, there are flip sides to that, which is that you can find water-washable resins, which, well, water's free, well, apart from what you pay for the pipes, but it's certainly not up to the cost of IPA. But, again, your mileage may vary. Some folks really like some of the slightly bendable resins, which at the moment, I've only ever seen that they require IPA cleaning. Normal resin, if you will, tends to be the water-washable stuff, and it's what I use. Now, all of my wargaming miniatures are printed in water-washable resin. I haven't had a problem with it in 3 years, but for some of those more exotic resins, you're going to want to invest in proper cleaning materials, and that's going to need a little bit of research. Now, one final note which could be a downside is that it is another skill set. 3D printing requires a whole new range of knowledge and what have you, which I found quite simple to pick up because it's relatively simple mechanics. Particularly with resin printing, you've got one moving part in the whole machine, which is just the build plate. Then it's a case of learning how to do your supports and what have you. Most places nowadays will offer you supported files when you purchase those, and that can be a really good way to study how it is that those are being done before you find your workflow and you figure out how you like to apply your own supports. So diagnosing issues, like if you have a misprint or something just goes wrong with the machine, because they're not infallible, sometimes it happens. Honestly, that's a little bit of iterative engineering that you got to figure out for yourself. The bonus with that, and especially as we have more people coming into the realm of 3D printing, you'll normally find someone online who can help. And particularly on Twitter or on Facebook, I've always had very good experience with folks chiming in when it's like, look, I have this really weird, specific issue. Normally, someone will be able to go, hey, I had that too, here's the solution. Otherwise, sometimes it's as simple as just drain your vat, re-level your bed, start over, and you'll find more often than not that solves the problem. But it is a new set of skills, so it's going to take a little bit of time to dial in your machine and dial in your new knowledge. Once you got that though, it's easy. So those are the downsides. And like I said, some of them more significant than others, but there are upshots too. And the most significant of those is price. Now, comparing how much it costs to print a miniature versus buying a plastic one. Well, obviously, if you're looking at buying a Lamborghini and you want to know the running costs of that, the cost of the car itself isn't what factors in. With 3D printers, there's ordinarily sales running or vouchers or what have you, so the cost of the machine I'm going to put aside for a second, and we're really going to focus on the running costs. So things like electricity, resin, changing the FEP, which is a little transparent screen at the bottom, and the screen itself, because all of those things are consumables. Now, when I say that the screen is a consumable, that's a difficult one to really pin down because my original Mars, I did have to replace the screen on that once, and that cost me 49 euros to change. Now, by comparison, I've been running a Mars 2 Pro for a little over 2 years. That's still fine, and I've been running that at least 3 times a week the entire time. So monochrome screens, they are orders of magnitude more long-lasting, so I honestly can't tell you how long a screen is going to last because mine's last me so long. Now, in a Twitter thread, I actually broke down the individual costs of all of these elements and estimated how much it costs to print a single 28mm infantry figure. And it works out, even at a really high-end estimate, you're looking at about 40 to 50 cents, that's US cents, per figure. That's it. That is taking into account changing the FEP, buying the resin, paying for the electricity to run the machine. I will link to that thread in the description so you can see the breakdown. And honestly, yeah, I wasn't sure when I got started. Is it really cheaper? Well, yes, by orders of magnitude. Now, when it comes to finding files that you want to print, whether it be infantry, vehicles, or what have you, most of the time, the best stuff you're going to find, you're going to have to pay for. But that's not a huge issue, especially if you take into account the fact that you're normally going to print more than one of these things. So a good example might be if I pay $20 for a squad of 10 infantry figures and I print them once, well, the cost of the machine, let's say that's $300, I spent $30 on resin and I spent $20 on the files. You're probably going to run those guys off a few times. If you're printing an army, over time, the individual cost per figure for the STLs themselves is going to come down exponentially. So bear in mind, how many of a thing do you want to print? That's going to quite significantly change up how you look at the cost of STL files. And speaking of STLs, that to my mind is one of the really big bonuses to 3D printing, of that there is so many cool sculptors out there. Folks who are doing really interesting little boutique style ranges who would struggle to find a producer who's willing to either cast in metal or cast in plastic and make available for sale. Folks who are really awesome sculptors who can do this in their spare time, pop the files up somewhere like My Mini Factory or Cults 3D and make them available. And then you, as the printer at home, have access to just a bewildering variety of cool stuff, individual parts in the case of places like Anvil Industry or Reptilian Overlords, D&D figures, really cool stuff, which would not be practical to produce on a commercial scale. Particularly as a wargamer, once I've dropped, say, $60 on all of the files I need for an army, well, in a lot of cases, if I were to go out and buy those things in plastic, $60 is a fraction of what I'm going to cost, and then I print them, and they will cost me cents per miniature. So, do you want a 3D printer? That's up to you. If those downsides are something that either you don't mind or you're prepared to mitigate, then honestly, I think it's kind of a no-brainer. There's a lot of great stuff out there to be printing. And if you're like me and you have an already enormous pile of grey plastic, you can supplement that with an enormous pile of unpainted resin miniatures too. But that's up to you. So as you can probably see, it's starting to get real hot in here, so I am going to call it. Thank you very much for your time, folks. And like I said, any questions, let me know. I will do my best to answer. You all enjoy the rest of your day.